Welcome to the DaveCast for Thursday, November 5th, as we continue in our study of the letter of James. And today we are continuing in a passage that is at the very end of chapter 3. So back on Tuesday, we mostly talked about the biblical meaning of one word that shows up twice in these few verses. And it's a word that is most often translated as gentle or gentleness in English, but that has a much deeper meaning in the Greek. And so just a very quick review from Tuesday. You might remember that I said that William Barclay in his commentary had called that word the most untranslatable of all the words in the New Testament. And I went on to read Barclay's description from his commentary that this word, the person with this quality, knows how to forgive when strict justice gives him perfect right to condemn. He knows how to make allowances when not to stand upon his rights, and how to temper justice with mercy. And so my point was that to have this quality is to believe that relationships are more important than always being right. Relationships are more important than being right. And of course, Jesus is the ultimate example of this, right? Jesus went to the cross when he had no sin, and he carried our sins there so that we could be in right relationship with God. And so that was the entire focus of Tuesday. But today I want to go back to this same passage and look at it a little bit more closely. I read the whole section at one time on Tuesday, but today let's just take it verse by verse, starting with verse 13. Now remember, the previous 12 verses at the start of this chapter, they talk about the tongue and our speech and the way that we talk to one another and about how to tame the tongue. And now James turns to the subject of wisdom. But when you stop to think about it, those two things overlap, right? How we speak, when we speak, how to say it, all of that is linked to wisdom. Sometimes we just think of wisdom in terms of what you know. What a person knows is knowledge. But here, James defines wisdom in terms of what you do as a result of what you know. And he says, "Who among you is wise and understanding? Let him show by his good behavior, his deeds, and the gentleness of wisdom." And so, what does it mean to be wise? Let him show it by his good works, his behavior. Wisdom is shown, James says, by what you do. Now listen, you wouldn't go to a financial manager who has a history of bankruptcy and is in debt up to his eyeballs, would you? I mean, even though that person might have an MBA from Harvard and be an op-ed writer for the Wall Street Journal, if he doesn't know how to manage his own money, I mean, there's not going to be a lot of credibility, right? Well, it's the same kind of thing with a Christian life. I mean, somebody could have all the knowledge in the world. They could have a PhD in New Testament. But if you aren't living it out by the manner in which you live, well, it's kind of like what Paul says in 1 Corinthians. You know, if you speak with the tongues of men and angels and understand all the mystery and knowledge, but you don't have love, it's nothing. And in this verse, we see here this word gentleness. And as I said Tuesday, I think that at the heart of that understanding is that relationships are more important than always having to be right. And sure, there are times and places for standing up for what is right. Of course there is. But wisdom is knowing what hill to die on. I mean, if you have to always be right and debate everything with everyone who disagrees with you, it's going to cost you in your relationships. It's going to cost you in your witness. And so wisdom is knowing, when just to agree to disagree. Now understand, he's also not saying that good behavior is what makes you wise. It is the wisdom is manifested by good behavior. You remember that this chapter began with a warning to those who would be teachers that thought themselves to have wisdom and understanding that could communicate with others. But the test of a teacher is not only in what the teacher says, but it's also in what the teacher does. I mean, and there's a reason for this. It's because you teach just as much by what you do as what you say. I mean, parents know this. And that's why discipleship involves so much more than teaching in a classroom or standing up and preaching from a pulpit. I mean, you can't disciple someone unless you give them the opportunity to see how you live. So let's go into verse 14. And he says, "But if you are selfish and have bitter jealousy in your hearts, do not brag. Your bragging is a lie that hides the truth. That kind of wisdom does not come from God, but from the world. It is not spiritual. It is from the devil." And so the word arrangement is a little strange here. It obviously doesn't mean that someone would be bragging about being selfish and having bitter jealousy. I mean, obviously, no one's going to brag about that. But I think what James is saying is that don't brag about how wise you are. If you're wise, it'll be obvious. I mean, there's an old saying, tell me what you brag about, and I'll tell you what you lack. And so up to this point, James had been calling believers to guard their words and actions and be doers of the word and not hearers only. I mean, this very big point for James. Being zealous for the things of God and having a passion for that which is honest and true is a good thing. However, when one's passion becomes just religiosity focused on ego and self-seeking, it goes in an ungodly direction. And it can have devastating effects. In fact, James says that this is from the devil. And so then finally on to verse 17 and 18. "But the wisdom that comes from God is first of all pure, then peaceful, gentle, and easy to please. This wisdom is always ready to help those who are troubled and to do good for others. It is always fair and honest. People who work for peace in a peaceful way plant a good crop of right living." And so here, James continues describing the difference between worldly wisdom and godly wisdom. Now, worldly wisdom, if we can call it wisdom, encourages us to be selfish and greedy and to put our own interests before the needs of others. But godly wisdom, on the other hand, it leads to peace and mercy and sincerity. And then James finishes this section with this beautiful word picture. And so imagine fields full and ready to harvest. We used to take an annual trip up to LJ around harvest time to get apples. Maybe you've done something like that too. And so imagine that in your mind's eye for a second. And so each year, the success of the harvest depends on those who cultivate the plants, tend the orchard, and pick the fruit, and of course the cooperation of weather patterns, but also successful pest management efforts and pruning and stuff. The harvest of our life efforts are like that. I think that's what James is saying. Just as the effort of the grower and the pickers is reflected in the bins of lovely, delicious fruit, so are the works of our life reflected in the fruits of our deeds. If we sow seeds of dissent in the soil that is filled with envy and selfishness, then our fruit's going to end up being bruised and rotten down to the core. But helping those who are troubled, doing good for others, welcoming and serving the weak and the marginalized and the poor and the outcast, that's how we grow God's kind of harvest. Getting there, from seed to mature harvest, it's not always easy. It's difficult to put relationships ahead of always having to be right. It's hard to put aside our own wants and desires and think of others first. Pruning can be painful. Cutting off a branch or discarding the excess fruit that crowds out the good fruit, that takes work. And yet, if we want to produce a fruitful harvest, it's the work we have to do. We've got to prune our selfishness and greed if we're going to produce mature fruit. And it can be tough and it hurts sometimes. But that is a necessary part of the process that's going to end up yielding a field of fruit full of harvest of peace. And that is the result of living by God's wisdom, as James says. God's wisdom is not necessarily found in those with the most education or the most money or the most popularity. True wisdom, God's wisdom, those are the fair and honest people who work for peace in a peaceful way and plant a good crop of right living. And so that brings us to the end of chapter 3 and a good place to stop for today. And so until next time, let's remember what Jesus said about this. He said, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God." So, my friends, let's be peacemakers and keep bringing the hope. God bless.